Media Center continues its work, and the topic of the next press briefing is how to counter anti-European Russian propaganda. And our speaker is Boris Nazhman, who is the professor of the Paris-Est Créteil University, and he is given the floor now.
Thank you, Tatiana. I'm really happy to be here. The thematic here is going to talk about the how do you answer actually to anti-European speeches, anti-European propaganda, and try to be very careful about how you answer and how you do actually your you think about answering and having the good way to settle the answers. So my point here is just to think about the strategy today of and the nature of the war, and also the strategy coming from the press in Moscow addressing the issue of the war, but also addressing also the issue of European Union. My point of view is that, and that's in the analysis, you can read it more when you read Russian papers, is that the objective of Russia is to fight European Union as a political construction. And that's something we're not used to in Europe, because we don't consider European Union as a political force or as a military force. So there is no way we imagine a proper answer to that. So why do we have the signal of anti-European speeches, and how do we read it carefully? The first thing we can see is that every revolution coming or every political changes that happen around Russia is considered to be organized by European Union in Russia. So that's their point of view. So in a way, Putin and the Kremlin, they consider they have to answer to that because it's a threat to their own power. So that's first. Second, the way how they do the war is a war that is, I would say, dissimulated or not open. So there is no Russian clear, let's say, signals of the army, or so you have to be careful about how the war is organized. So it's a hidden war, and in a way, the hidden war means that you don't act legally. You act in other ways using paramilitary troops, volunteers. So that's something that is happened during Balkan wars, and it's something that was always done on purpose, because the way how you do the war is not going to be legal. So you're going to target civilians, or you're going to do it in a way where you don't want to have direct problem considering the international justice, for instance. The other important thing to answer when you listen to propaganda is to understand the words that I said during the speeches. And I've been confronted very early in 2014, speaking at France 24, to advisor of Putin. So in the debate, I heard about the words they are using, and they always speak in terms of we and you, us and you. So opposing and saying, we defend the democracy, you are the dictatorship, basically. That's the way how they act. So I asked some friends around me to explain me from where is coming this rhetoric, because I was not used to heard it during the Soviet Union, and this rhetoric is coming from the 30s. So it's something connected with the repression period. And it's very tough when you hear it, because it's something very violent. So you hear the violence already in the words before it comes in the acts. So in a way, you have to anticipate the violence that is coming during the speeches. So here you have 2 points of view. Usually in Europe, we consider that just as a speech, so it's not very much dangerous. The problem is that as Ukraine is facing war, you have in the same momentum basically an invasion and basically crime committed. So you need to be able to answer and anticipate to the words that are proposed and imposed. If you listen carefully, in fact, most of the speeches, you can sometimes even anticipate the actions. So the way what you have to do to answer to anti-European propaganda usually is to anticipate what will be the next step. So that's first. Second is the investigation. effectively, we're lacking, maybe here, but also in Europe, investigation journalism, and sometimes we lack the capacity to know how and what is the objective of the policies. And that's important to do when you face some regime that are trying to export their model. Here again, we tend to be naive, thinking that Russia is not willing to export his political model, but the way they act, they try to export the political model to European Union, meaning that supporting parties in Europe, political parties that are anti-European, is their main strategy. I think when you get to this point, you understand that in a way we are weak at the moment because we accept this rhetoric as normal, sort of usual, when it appeared to be very destabilizing the institution in the country where we are. So let's take some examples, you will see. Not so much the referendum that was now in Holland, but the one that is coming in England is more interesting. So for the Brexit, we call it referendum, there is a clear position of Russia on the Brexit. And they push some point of view that you can read explicit in the press in Russia about that. So, of course, they're in favor of England getting out of European Union. So when we try to understand why, it seems to be strange because why Russia is interesting to England getting out. But the way they express this is they use the term oppression, they use the term that European Union is a kind of dictatorship or kind of jail for England. They use the rhetoric corresponding to ultranationalist movement in Europe. So they try to mimic or to use the rhetoric you find in, for instance, in French, in Front National, or you can find in different populist parties. They're not necessarily the source of this argument, they just use them in order to promote them, okay? Of course, it's not the same, like if just one party like Vlaams Belang or whatever parties in Europe is taking stands that are extreme right, and when they have a strong support from outside, it's quite different. And that is what we face at the moment in Europe. The other aspect that I want to share with you today is just to think about what we can do in the future facing that. So I like the approach of Kasparov on that. So he says winter is coming in the way that we're coming to a situation where, yes, we're in destabilized world. Yes, there is a kind of authoritarian regime's proposal for Europe. Yes, it is powerful, but we can be prepared to that, and we should be prepared, and we should try to make it as short as possible. So in a way, we should not go accepting the defeat. So now I want to give some ideas about the strategy concretely to get an answer to this not only propaganda, but also the action clearly that is done by the regime in Russia. The first one is probably, and it's important, but maybe not only symbolic, is that Europe, but also in Ukraine, we can offer a status of refugee to deserters from Russia. So that's something that is very important for the army, so to protect people that are not willing to fight. I've seen very few people proposing that, but it's a very important step. And every step you have to take at the moment should be subversive, because when you face an authoritarian regime, you have to find ways that are subversive to that. The second way that is quite important for you here is the discussion, the open discussion. Let's call it political coffees or political meetings where you organize open discussion about the way how you will find a way to answer to the propaganda. I don't have the concept to answer. Nobody has alone. So it's only by the face-to-face discussion and meetings that you find ways, open meetings, you find ways to answer to the propaganda. You can't simply do it through internet or through my speech. You have to do it by regular meetings where people give their point of view and anticipate what will happen. They have to think forward. Okay? So that's second. And it was very much used, for instance, in Belgium in the 90s, the political cafes, to organize a new way to think politically. And it was used by the Ecological Party, for instance. Okay? And that's very powerful because you create a dynamic, a political dynamic in the same time of changes in the country, but in the same time you find a way to answer to anti-women speeches, anti-foreigner speeches, anti-European speeches, okay? At the moment you find this very common speeches at the moment in a lot of cases, and it's difficult to answer if you are just acting alone. So the last point to me that I want to make today, and then I'm happy to answer to any questions, is just to tell you how much it is connected, the thing, and how much it is coherent. So sometime in the world that we face in Europe, we have the impression that the speeches that we face, that we can call hate speeches or things like that, are not coherent, and that in a way is disturbing. But if you look carefully, you face something that looks coherent, so you have to be very prepared to answer, because if you are not prepared, in a way you let this kind of speech to win, and then you get win not only politically but in the facts. So anything you can do to answer to this kind of speech is very important right at the moment and thinking forward.
Thank you very much, Boris. Чи в когось з наших колег є запитання? Поки немає,
Do you have questions? So,
So my first question would be just to precise what you told about this political dialogue and about these political coffees. Would you please explain whom should Ukraine talk with about these issues? Are you speaking about Russian civil society, about Russian opposition, or you mean mostly European partners? I mean Europeans, European countries, etc. Because on one hand we do understand that the political dialogue with Russia is important, but you should understand that it's also quite difficult now, given the war and the tense relations with Russia for 2 years already.
Yeah. I think the discussion should be as much as local in the beginnings.
Я вважаю,
And then open to foreigners, whatever they come. But it's difficult to discuss at the moment with the civil society in Russia, because I think it's the dialogue is first to be set here between people, because the resistance and the way how you resist to this kind of speech is very much to be settled in Ukraine first. I think the idea that you just make a dialogue with Russia is not enough. To be honest, it's a little bit naive. I've seen it in other contexts, like the Balkan War, where you propose just dialogue. It's not working when you have a regime that has committed crimes and systematic crimes against civilians. So in a way, for instance, I wanted to give you an example about the kind of rhetoric. They tend to say, for instance, that the war in Ukraine is a civil war. Well, how do we address that? You address that by considering that, no, the war is not civilian, but it's against the civilians. That's different. And it's not a war that is just between Ukrainians, it's a war that is imported, of course. But that the target of the war is also to destroy the capacity of people to live together in the same place. So that's a very important target of the regime in Russia, is to destroy the capacity of people living together in Ukraine. So that's the only way you answer to that is by culture, by meetings, by doing things that make sense to the life here. Because if you accept the destruction, you accept that the meaning of the life you have here is disappearing. So now, dialogue with Russia is difficult. Dialogue with civil society in Russia is difficult. I have no idea how you do when you have a sort of washing machine of ideology coming in Russia, and where people are in the washing machine. So you have no stop button. You have not the button when you say just stop the propaganda. What you have as a way is where you live to improve the dialogue at the place where you are. Oui.
Damien Triomphe, Radio France. Est-ce que le prisme que vous appliquez sur la propagande russe, il peut être appliqué sur les autres pays, sur les autres, sur l'Occident, ou sur l'Europe, sur les États-Unis? Ou alors est-ce qu'il y a vraiment une spécificité russe?
The question to our speaker is those specifics of Russian propaganda he mentioned, can they be applied to other European countries and other continents?
Yes, partly you're right, Damien. I think that there is something common, actually, in the speeches. As I said before, Russia is not inventing concept. They are taking from extreme right parties, usually in Europe. They are using weaknesses we have to develop the rhetoric that is already there. If you take the case of Trump, it's just using the way how Trump is speaking as a way to promote it more and to make it more systematic, it's just that way, and financing, if it's possible, is welcome. But it is not about, of course, it is not the same situation when you face a situation of war in your country and you have the propaganda in the same time, then when you are in France, when you have also the propaganda from the Front National, but you have no open conflict, fortunately for us. So the situation is not exactly the same, because in the situation where you face an open war, occupation of territory, of course the propaganda is much more harmful, because you feel that it's destroying part of your society. But it is common in a way, you're right, it is common. And in a way, we may learn lessons from what's going on in Ukraine to find ways also for us to fight the kind of extremism that is coming. I just want to say something about that. It's very important. Is that the strategy that was applied in Chechnya or by Assad in Syria, but also in Ukraine by Putin, is just destroying moderates. So the way he acts, he wants only to talk to extremism in the political life and not to have people in between that are moderated. So the only strong moderated part of the population in Ukraine actually is the civil society that is able to create new ways, new concepts that are resisting to that. So it's quite important to understand that he wants to have only extremists in front of him and not anymore anybody that is moderate.
Шановні колеги, чи є ще запитання? Будь ласка, представляйтеся.
The other question.
First, thank you for your advice to us, the Ukrainians. And my question will be, how is Europe going to deal with this harmful impact of Russian propaganda? Because if we take, for example, the case of Brexit that is largely discussed now and has been mentioned in your speech, and then we take the situation in Netherlands where 63 or something like that % of population voted against the association with Ukraine. We may understand that this propaganda really has influence on people, and people believe that. What is Europe going to do with that? Thank you.
First of all, the propaganda from Russia is influencing extreme right and extreme left sometimes also. That is quite disturbing for us in France, for instance, that the Front Gauche, extreme left, is influenced by this propaganda and is taking the same stance. So it's difficult when you're taking in sandwich, in between. But I will say that you start resisting, and your question is how we in Europe we can find ways to resist to that also, and how much is strong this influence on us. I think that the way how the propaganda acts is connected to the way how they do the war and how they act on the military side. So, but in Europe they use also the election process to misuse it in a way. So the election process or referendum can be dangerous because they can be misused when you get people just voting not for the question that is asked or not for the purpose. So you just use this vote not to address, let's say you try to use it to address an issue that is in France or the European Union, but not exactly the one that you want to show. So again, you act hidden. So let's take an example. If Russia wants to, let's say, to export an authoritarian regime, they will not announce it, but they will use the migration questions in Europe to push Europe to be more radical and to be more extremist on this issue, thinking that at the end they will get, the result is to get a regime that is more authoritarian, okay? So you have to be very, very careful about that. And I think at the moment, as I said before, I think we are just very weak. We don't have ourselves lesson to give because we are not finding the way, just because the society is divided and very isolated. Everybody's there. So we don't find a solution alone.
Шановні колеги, якщо в когось є ще запитання, будь ласка.
Дуже дякую.
Я не бачу. So my
There are no questions.
I'll ask you my last question, which is very important to us. You were talking about this anti-European propaganda of Russian Federation, and we do understand that both sides, I mean Ukraine and Europe, has to tackle this propaganda. But the question is, who will be more efficient according to you? Because if Ukrainians will talk about this anti-European propaganda, it could be perceived like a counter-propaganda from Ukrainian side because we are involved in the conflict. On the other side, if Europeans do that themselves, probably it will be more efficient. What's your point of view on this?
I think you should develop the concepts here and share it then with us. And then use any way you can to spread it, not necessarily from Ukraine, but to spread it around. But the first step is to get the good ideas and the good strategy to answer to that. And that is, I think you are more you are in a better position because you are facing the aggression, so you know how to answer it more than when we are in France. And then spreading it and using media abroad and using other ways to go is effectively what you have to do. Any contact you can use in Baltic States, everywhere you have to use it. You need to have also regional islands, so more contact with Romania, more contact around, just because that's very important to spread the information. My feeling is that you can learn a lot from what happened also in the Balkan countries, because Balkan wars in the beginning of the 90s, because you will learn what is ultranationalism, how it acts within the states. And that's quite important to know about what happened and to be aware how the civil society tried to resist to that. So, but if you can use any ways to spread it abroad and saying that it's not your idea, but you just want to share it, that will be effectively more efficient.
Thank you very much, Boris. Дуже дякую. На цьому ми завершимо.
Thank you very much. We end our briefing. The next briefing in several minutes. The briefing will be to the topic